Alrighty. So I want you guys to complete this ed puzzle just to compare your results to see whether the traits that you observed on yourself, if those traits that you had were dominant traits or recessive traits. So let's get started. So attached earlobes, believe it or not, are recessive. So if you remember from that little guided video, I showed you my earlobes. My earlobes were detached. So I'm um, representing the dominant trait. But if you were attached, then you would have been, your earlobes would have been recessive. Widow's peak. Widow's peak is dominant. So I was recessive. I had no widow's peak. So if you had a widow's peak, if you have that point in the middle of your forehead for your hairline, then you are experiencing or showing the dominant version of this trait. Hitchhiker's thumb. A hitchhiker's thumb, much like my weird thumb, is recessive. Um, so straight thumb is dominant, hitchhikers recessive. Bent pinkies are dominant. So my pinkies are straight. What were yours? Dominant, bent like this picture, or straight, which would be the recessive one, like mine. Tongue rolling. So if you could roll your tongue, that is dominant. That is the dominant version or the dominant allele of the trait. If you couldn't, then that is recessive. Dimples. If you have dimples, that is the dominant version of the dimple trait. If not, then no dimples would be recessive. Now, if you are right-handed like myself, that is the dominant version of the trait. So left-handed, in this case, is recessive. Freckles are dominant. I myself do not have freckles, at least not all year round. So I would be considered to have the recessive version of this trait. Excuse me. If you have freckles, like this picture here, then that is dominant. So curly hair is dominant to straight hair. So somehow Taylor Swift is an anomaly of genetics and she has both. Just kidding. But again, curly hair is dominant. So if your hair is naturally curly, you have the dominant version of this trait. If it is straight, then you have the recessive version of this trait. And last one, if you folded your hands and when you did that and you interlinked your fingers, if your right thumb was over your left thumb, that is the recessive version or the recessive allele for this trait. So if you were left over right, like me, that would be the dominant version. So the whole idea is that from doing this, hopefully you realized that just because a trait is dominant doesn't necessarily make it the most frequent gene in the gene pool. It just depends on what other versions of this gene are around.